Hello and welcome to week 12 of government. This is 12, isn't it? Yes, it is. We're going to be talking about money, 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 money. Basically, the tax money that fuels government operations. Can't talk about government without talking about money. Before we get started, though, a few weeks ago, we had a question when we were talking about the U.S. interstate system. I mentioned that in the original layout of the original interstates, that the Eisenhower administration's transportation department mandated that 1 out of every 5 miles of interstate be straight. Again, for civil defense, just in case we had to use the interstates to land planes. And of course, there's always the possibility that a plane would have to use one to make an emergency landing. But in addition to the cars, of course, we had this interstate highway system of airplane landing strips if we needed to for civil defense. So anyway, 1 out of every 5 miles on the original interstates, not the ones that have been built since then, had to be straight. Well, it happened. Thursday night near Minneapolis, Minnesota, single-engine Cessna started to lose power, but he was right over Interstate 35. Here's what it looked like. Pretty cool, huh? You might be cool, but you'll never be as cool as that guy or girl. I don't know who it was. As a pilot, I did read that they were fine. They got out of their plane. Just like it would be with an accident, a wrecker came by, picked up the disabled plane, and towed it off to get fixed, and everyone was okay. And I was reading one of the experts in that story with the National Transportation Safety Board. He said, yeah, it's a last resort, but if you do it, make sure because you're going to be about the same speed as the cars. Don't worry about slowing down for the cars. You're going to be doing more or less the same speed as them. It was amazing. And thank God nobody got hurt. But yeah, so chalk one up to the U.S. interstate highway system. Not too shabby, huh? Anyway, our subject this week is budgets. Budgets mean money. Money, if we're talking about government generating it, money means taxes. A budget is basically a plan of spending. You anticipate the money that you will take in, and with that, you try to figure out what you will spend it on. We do it as a family. You're probably at the age now where any big family expenditures, mom and dad or whomever will call you in just to get your thought on it. One of the big things that we as a family have to do when setting our family budgets is to determine necessary and optional spending. This is what we have to spend on. This is what we want to spend on. You get the have-tos out of the way first. The mortgage or rent, groceries, clothes for everybody, school fees, the light bill, the water bill, the cable bill. That's not just cable, but internet connectivity. That's a necessity these days. No matter how it used to be a nicety, now it's a necessity. Yeah, all the stuff you gotta spend. And if there's any left over, then you can budget for what you want to spend. If there's none, then you have to tighten your belt. Every government entity, from the national government to the smallest little municipality, if they exist as a town, a charter town, they have something resembling a budget. They operate on that basis. They generate money on that basis, and they try to anticipate the revenues. Now, again, as you would expect, the federal government's budget is big. The U.S. government is the largest budget on the planet, and it's not even close. The fifth largest budget on the planet is the state of California. It's big. A whole bunch of money out there. Making this a little bit more complicated is the fact that governments, of course, are going to get numerous requests for spending every year. Every single group, every single person has an idea on where that tax revenue should go. And of course, since we are paying the tax revenue, we should have a say. People look to government to maintain roads, to provide public health care services, and to spend money on some things that we have deemed to be optional. That happens all the time. Now, elected officials have to make decisions about spending this money in the right way. If they do it poorly, then, the best thing that can happen is they get voted out. Much like the family does, the government has to set priorities. For most people, if we're talking federal government here, your number one priority is going to be military spending. If you don't have a decent military, then you won't have to worry about spending anything. Somebody else is going to be calling the shots for you. Let's take a look at U.S. tax revenue. And this is for the United States. And let me go ahead and give you a sample of not just well, first off, we'll take a look at total federal tax revenues. This is for the fiscal year 2015, $3.18 trillion. Federal tax revenues for 2015. This is to say the government took in $3.18 trillion. That's a lot of money. Anyway, this is what we're looking at here with this pie chart, though, is the source of the revenue. You'll see nearly half of it here in the blue is individual income taxes. This big slice on the left, the big orange slice there that looks like it's about a third or so, that's from payroll taxes. The individual income tax is what is directly removed from your payroll. You get a paycheck, you'll see where that's taken out. The orange is what we call FICA. This is FICA. FICA taxes, that's the 7.625 tax that we have right now in the U.S. Your employer pays half, you pay half, so it's an effective 15.3 tax that goes towards Social Security and Medicare, easily outside of defense, the two largest expenditures in our government. So FICA taxes here, half comes from you, half comes from the employee, and as we go back to the 2015 revenues chart, you see that between individual income taxes and payroll taxes, yeah, we're talking 85% of the federal budget comes from us and our employers in this case. So, yeah, federal government makes a whole lot of money off of it. It's hard to fathom, but we did not have an individual income tax in the United States until 1913. That means we survived almost 150 years without this 85% of the revenue that we talked about. How did we do that? Well, government was much smaller then. The idea as to what is a good and proper function of government was very small. There was no unemployment insurance. Defense spending was a fraction of what it is now. There was no Medicare, no Social Security, none of these programs. There was, practically for a long time, no infrastructure programs, no electricity to help set up, no, water sewer systems to set up. Yeah, different society altogether. We didn't need a federal income tax until 1913. Now it accounts for 85% of our federal revenues in just the course of a century. A couple of other things to note here. You'll notice the corporate income taxes make up 11% of the revenue. Those are taxes that are levied on corporations or businesses of a certain size. Excise taxes, the one in gray up here, the 3%, that is taxes that government collects on specific items, federal gasoline tax and stuff like that. Those are commodity type taxes. Customs duties, the little green sliver right here, those are what we make on items that are shipped through the ports of America, our trade partners and whatnot. As you can, that was one time a very primary source of revenue for the federal government. Now it is just 1%. And miscellaneous means what it says. I mean, that's all kinds of other stuff. Basically, fees that you pay for service. You pay $25 to go into a national park or something like that. All that is collected under there. So you get an idea of the scope of the revenues collected by the United States government. And again, it ain't chicken feed, as we well know. Now, how is that money spent? Let's take a look right now at U.S. Expenditures. Another little pie graph here. You will see that At once upon a time, defense spending was our number one item. This is fiscal year 2016, so a year after we saw the other one here. Um, Now the biggest is Social Security, far and away. Now, if you want to remember those FICA taxes they pay for Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and all that, that is more than, look at this is more than half of federal spending on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And again, none of this existed a century ago. So you can see, just get an idea of just how the size and scope of government have expanded in just the course of 1 century. It is completely different now. On the left side over here, we see defense, $587.6 billion. That is a major expenditure. And let's look at the two little light blue, aqua, and yellow up here. The net interest is the interest we have to pay on the national debt. That is, the debt is the accumulated annual deficits. Deficits, 1 year worth of spending shortfall. Deficit is the cumulative effect of that. Right now, the deficit is $22 trillion, I believe. I haven't checked it this morning. It's always going up. So that money, that debt has interest that we have to pay. So you can see that yellow part of the pie gets a little fatter every year because our debt gets bigger every year. That's bad. Down here at the bottom, the dark blue, the royal blue, is what's called discretionary spending. Basically, all the other parts of this pie chart here are considered mandatory spending by code, by law, by previously passed law. These are monies that have to be spent. There's no debating about them. The only thing Congress can debate is the percentages that they are willing to spend. Of course, they can amend the law, and they do all the time to govern what we spend on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. But these right here have to be spent according to current law. The blue, that royal blue, is discretionary spending. That's stuff we don't necessarily have to spend on. But in the budgeting process, we have decided that whatever this discretionary spending amounts to is a good idea. We have decided that, yes, this is something we're going to spend money on. And so it continues. So, yeah, with that, we get a decent idea of what the federal government brings in and what they spend it on. Budget considerations bring forth the same debate in Congress every year. Conservatives tend to favor defense spending, but like to spend lighter on the others. Democrats tend to like the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid spending, not so keen on the defense. There are variations of that, of course. I mean, and that little description right there is not true all the time. It is true about 80 to 90% of the time. It's a stereotype for a reason. Of course, again, separation of powers. The legislative branch, Congress, appropriates the money, sets up the budget, and, of course, the executive branch spends the money. All of these, the administration of all of this, falls under the executive branch. I love the way that where the book goes here. They say it is easier to get a government program started than it is to get one stopped. You ain't kidding. Think about this. If you start a government program, you have identified what you think is a need. You have identified a need, and you have budgeted money to create resources, people, equipment, stuff to address this need. What happens if you try to remove that program? The need that you've identified goes unaddressed. Also, the people that you have hired to carry out this program are now unemployed. You can see the resistance to ending a program once it's started, because you have these people that are laid off mad at you now, and the people who are benefiting from your service mad at you right now. You don't win any votes by taking cookies away from people. You don't win any votes by putting people out of work. So as a result, Congress is loath to end any program that they start. One of the great minds of our generation, Milton Friedman, the great economist, had this to say about it. There's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. Uncle Milty nailed that one. Now, there are ways to get around this idea. Sometimes programs or efforts are put in with written in sunset laws. That is to say, this is going to happen for a specified amount of time, and on January 1st, 2025, it ends. Boom, boom, boom. That's one way you can combat it and say, hey, I didn't vote it down. It just ended. So there are ways to get around that. But boy, once a government program has got its hooks dug into a society, it's there. Again, if you think we're spending too much on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that's one thing. I'm an extremist. I don't believe these are proper defined functions of the federal government. But it would be foolish to end them tomorrow. There are people that have come to rely on that. There are people whose very livelihoods have now come. It's like a drug addict. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but you have become addicted to that, and whether it's good or not, and to just yank the needle out of the arm and let you go cold turkey is fatal. So no, I would like to see us at least rein it in. There's no evidence that that is ever going to happen, though. Again, once you hand out this, other groups that may not be getting that are going to want something. And how does a politician get reelected? He keeps his constituents happy. How do you keep constituents happy? You keep giving them stuff. There's an old saying that everybody hates Congress but loves their congressman. That's because their congressman can work to bring stuff into their district. If they get a federal grant to build a water treatment plant in the middle of their district, that doesn't do the other 434 congressional districts any good. But for him, that congressman, he's going to get reelected because he's keeping his people happy. Now, what do you do when you have 435 of them trying to keep their people happy? That's a lot of money to be spent, and there's no incentive right now for any member of Congress to force the government to spend less. They have zero incentive to do that. They have 100% incentive to spend more. That's why spending is going through the roof. It does not benefit government to spend less. We have talked about the federal government. Let's talk about state revenues and expenditures. The one big difference between federal and state governments is that for the states, 49 out of the 50 states have a balanced budget requirement. They cannot run a deficit. They have to spend exactly to the penny how much they take in. Federal government, God help them, under no such constraints. State governments have to. I like that. That creates what is called fiscal discipline. That means sometimes, and it stinks, but sometimes you have to say no. Sometimes we have to cut. I think that is fiscal discipline. I think that's the way I have to run my family budget. They don't let me run a deficit. I don't think government should either. Anyway, that's the big difference between the federal and the state governments. Now, of course, state government doesn't have one other advantage the federal government can have. Federal government can print money. Wouldn't that be fun to do? Well, the problem with printing money is this thing called inflation, where if you print more money, then the money becomes worth less. Not worthless, but worth less. If you keep throwing new dollar bills into the economy, that dollar bill spending power is going to be less. What you could buy today for $1, tomorrow you'd have to spend $2 on because of inflation. That's, there is an economic argument sometimes in some situations that would call for printing more money. We're going to discuss more of this in our econ section during the spring and early summer. But anyway, we talked about the idea behind the $1 trillion or something. I won't get into that, but let's go ahead and shift gears now to what a state budget looks like. We're going to focus on Virginia because we live in Virginia, oddly enough. And this is a pie graph look, and I'm sorry I didn't get this with a better background here. I'm going to move this up here. Right here is the basic source of revenue in the state of Virginia. And you see it's very simple. 3/4 of Virginia's taxes come from individual and corporate income tax. basically the taxes that the state takes out of our paycheck, much like the Fed does with FICA and the federal withholding. Yeah, the state, and of course they have a corporate tax in Virginia too. 17.4% is instituted what's called a sales tax. That is a tax that's applied on every purchase you make. You buy a pack of gum, you buy a pack of nabs, you buy a six-pack of beer, you buy a wedding dress. It's a sales tax. A state sales tax, 4.5%, I believe it is now. And that is a source of 17.4% of state revenue. All the other taxes and fees and stuff, the state taxes on hunting and fishing licenses and things like that, all the other stuff only adds up to 7.5%. So yes, the state is largely reliant on the tax dollars it collects from citizens, businesses, and corporations. Now, how is that money spent in Virginia? Well, here's a look at it. And again, I'm just going to kind of move this around over here so we can see it a little bit better. The number one source of expenditures for Virginia is education. Again, we as a society have decided that educating the masses is a proper function of government. Constitution does not give the federal government that power, so it falls on the 50 states. And as a result, this is one of the biggest expenditures in Virginia. It is the largest expenditure, and education, of course, is a huge part of the state budget. The other, almost a third, health and human resources. That kind of ties in with the federal Medicare, Medicaid program, because those programs, although funded nationally, are administered at the state level. So you got Virginia Medicare, Medicaid, North Carolina Medicare, Medicaid, so forth. That ends up resulting in about a third of Virginia's spending. Again, you'll see the other smaller parts of this: general government, the state administration, executive offices, public safety, state police, state emergency management, the State Bureau of Investigations, and that little 5.1% goes to all the catch-all stuff that isn't covered in the other stuff. So again, education and health are far and away the two biggest expenditures here in the state of Virginia. The book gives us an awful lot of information on taxes and the difference between the federal and individual taxes, the tax code, and things like that. I'm not going to cover an awful lot of that because we're going to be looking at that in great detail early next calendar year when we shift from government to economics. So I'm not going to worry too darn much about that at this point. Just suffice to know that out of your paycheck, government takes individual taxes, the FICA taxes, Medicare and Social Security. State takes out their state taxes. And as you could tell, that is a significant part of the revenue of all of those entities. Let's bring it down a little bit further, closer to home. In addition to federal and state taxes, we also pay local taxes. Some of you live in Pennsylvania County, some of you live in Danville. We're going to, just for the purposes of discussion here, focus on revenues in the city of Danville. City of Danville, $113 million in the current fiscal year that we are in, 2020. Now, this was an odd year because of the coronavirus and all that, but this is the totals here are pretty well the same. And the city did a pretty good job of putting out this visual aid to give you an idea of where the $113 million is coming from. Up here, upper left, general property taxes. Again, that's a tax on your land, on your tangible real estate. The state does not tax your property. The U.S. does not tax your land. The locality does. Pennsylvania County or the city of Danville. That is the primary source of their revenue. You'll see over here the other local taxes, and I'll take a break now and kind of describe what that may mean. The other local taxes is revenue that is raised from non-personal property tax. There is a car tax. There's one in Virginia, it's a very small one, but there's also a local car tax if you own a vehicle. If you're a business, you might have to pay extra taxes. Hotel taxes. There is a cigarette tax in the city of Danville and in every other city in Virginia. There are machinery and tools taxes at the local level. If you own a business with certain machinery, you have to pay a tax on that, and that all goes into this. One of the problems that we have as a locality in Virginia, Virginia is what is known as a Dillon Rule state. Dillon Rule basically, and I'll bring this slide up to kind of give you an idea of the theory behind it, maintains political subdivision of a state, city or county, is connected to the state like a child is connected to a parent. God, I hate that analogy, but that's what it says. It's used to interpret state law where there's a question of whether a local government has a certain power. Remember when we talked about the supremacy clause? When there's a question between state law and federal law always trumps it. Dillon Rule basically says that at the state level. If there's a conflict in a city or county policy and the state is supreme. What the Dillon Rule also does is it narrowly defines the power of local governments. In our case, the biggest restriction is that there are only certain specific things that we can use to tax citizens. In a way, that's good. I love anything that puts restraints on government power. But if you're in the city of Danville and you're trying to balance a budget, and the Dillon Rule prevents you from raising 5 cents on a sales tax or something like that, you got to get it from somewhere else if you're going to spend the money. So yeah, Dillon Rule can be very good. It could also be very, very limiting. Lots of localities think they could balance their local budgets easier if they would just be allowed just a 2% sales tax on all items. But the Dillon Rule says you can't do that. So cities have to be creative. Again, within the Dillon Rule, they are very restricted. And again, I like government restrictions in general, but I can understand how this would be very frustrating. Now, Dillon Rules also apply to other things. I'll put this up here. I hate these little see-through graphics here, but Dillon Rules also govern how Virginia can open schools. In this right here, those that are in the blue can open before Labor Day because of weather issues. There are a couple red, like in the Charlotte County here and City of Martinsville, innovative or experimental program. One of their schools opens before Labor Day, another does not, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the ones in the yellow over here have no waiver. They, by state law, have to open after Labor Day. And you'll notice a lot of them are in the state's eastern part, east of I-95, Richmond, Northern Neck, Delmarva, Tidewater, southeastern Virginia. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the state wants those school systems to open after Labor Day and not before Labor Day? Think about that. We'll talk about that in class Monday. I'm going to see what kind of answers you give. You might not like the answer that's given, but it's the reason. Anyway, that's something we've talked about for years. Let's get back to the city's revenue. And again, we've talked about where the money comes from in Danville. This is where the money goes. The biggest expenses for local, and this is kind of, for some it's more, it's going to be public safety and education. That is the vast majority of what a city or county spends their money on. Public safety is police, sheriff's department. Operating a jail is expensive. It is a very expensive undertaking. Schools are very expensive. Teachers and administrators have to be paid. Buildings have to be purchased. Buildings have to be maintained. Buildings have to be cleaned. Transportation. Buses have to be purchased, have to be gassed up, have to be maintained. They have to have drivers paid. Lots of money spent on education and public safety. Again, we as the society has decided this is a proper function of government to spend money on these. The other ones up here, health and welfare, parks and recreation. Public works is a big expenditure, obviously. You want to make sure the water pipes work. When you turn that spigot on in the morning, you expect to get water and not nothing. Judicial administration, we mentioned the jails, of course, that covers the courts and all that. And, a lot of, we talked about discretionary and obligatory spending, mandated spending. The state of Virginia requires the city of Danville to spend money on certain things, that mandates from the state that we have to spend the money on. So again, I hope this just gives you kind of an overview of where the tax dollars come from, national, state, and local, and where they're going. Again, these are all rough estimates, and we'll always debate how much we should spend and whatnot, but that's how they get the money and where the money goes in general. We'll talk a little bit more about taxation, like I mentioned, in the economics portion of this year. The last little segment of this week's lesson talks about some of the broader philosophies behind the idea of taxation and what we're spending it on. Again, I'm libertarian. That's my political philosophy. Don't like Democrats. Can stand Republicans. Not a fan. But anyway, that's what we do. We believe in maximum, absolute maximum individual liberty at every possible turn. Every time we can get away with it. When in doubt, err on the side of freedom. So, one of the phrases that has come to be used, usually in a pejorative sense about us libertarians, is our propensity to say taxation is theft. A lot of people say, oh, he's a libertarian. Hey, taxation is theft. Anyway, it is. Theft is the taking of property with someone without their permission. I have not given permission, explicit permission, to take money from me via way of taxes. Now, there's the argument. Some will say that we are part of an unwritten social contract, and therefore just by being born, we are giving permission to have taxes taken out. Is permission possible where the denial of permission is impossible? There is no way I can opt out. So there's no way that you can say I automatically opt in. Anyway, that having been said, in the very strictest definition, taxation is theft. But it is legal theft. It is legal. The government can legally take money out of you. The fact that it's legal theft does not prevent it being theft, but it is legal. The reason we think about taxation in such a manner is to remind us that taxation should, in a free country, be our last possible resort. Unfortunately, the way we have done things, it is now our default setting. It is the first thing we consider. It is our default setting. It is what we go to first. If we can at least put a dent in that mindset that makes the idea of taxation so odious that we only go that route when there is no other alternative, we will be better off in the long run. There will still be taxes, of course, because there are things that we have deemed, yes, government does have that authority, and we will pay for it. But the whole idea behind taxation as theft is to remind us that it should not be our default setting for every single problem. Rant over. The idea of what government should do in terms of the reach it has for day-to-day lives, that's going to be a debate we always have. And again, thank God we can debate this. If we don't have the ability to debate this, we're not free. The very strict interpreters of the Constitution argue that government should exercise only specific delegated powers and that the citizens retain the bulk of political and financial power. Boy, that seems like a quaint notion now, doesn't it? Yeah, that ship has sailed, unfortunately. We have decided that there are many, many, many things that government is responsible for, and as a result, we, as individuals, are not responsible for. The question of whether the federal government could constitutionally undertake a program of so-called internal improvements infrastructure was debated hotly in the early 19th century. Remember our old friend the Cumberland Road? Built in, construction began in 1811 and went through 1837. That pretty much answered the question about is there a role for government in terms of maintaining or even initiating national infrastructure. And of course, today, as we look at, remember, the U.S. highway system, and of course, what we talked about at the top here, the U.S. interstate system, yes, we have clearly agreed that there is a role for government in creating and maintaining a certain national infrastructure. Now, of course, as we move into the digital age, does that power extend to creating national digital infrastructure? That's a debate we will be having as we go on. The establishment of a national bank was another hotly debated topic in the early 19th century. Andrew Jackson, Democratic president, was very, very much opposed to it. He said it was not mentioned in the Constitution, therefore we should not do it. I would agree. But we have a national bank now. So what you going to do? You going to shut the bank down? That's the problem with these programs. Again, once you start a government program, it is next to impossible to stop it. So be careful what you start. This was something that your book included that I found fascinating. It seems like it was written 1,000,000 years ago, the way the philosophy is, but it was actually in 1887. President Grover Cleveland vetoed a congressional appropriation of $10,000 to help farmers in Texas who were suffering from a drought. In his veto message, I'm going to read this straight up. Listen to these words. It's only a couple of paragraphs. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering, which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. A prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadily resisted. To that end, the lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people. That last sentence sounds harsh, but it is true. There's always going to be suffering. It is part of living. Is it the government's job to alleviate any and all suffering? Grover Cleveland believed that private charities should and would assist those struggling farmers, not the federal government. As it turned out, history in this case would prove him right. The farmers in question in Texas ended up getting about $100,000 worth of support from private charities and churches, 10 times more than what Congress was appropriating. When's the last great hospital or university been built under a charity? I mean, we all know the great Christian institutions, Jesuit colleges and universities, hospitals. When's the last time that happened? It's been over a century. And why? We do not rely on public philanthropy or private charity as much as we used to. Why? We've subcontracted that to government. We have made the government our charity. We have put government in charge of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a whole lot of things that private charity used to do. Now, again, I'm not an ogre. I don't think we should end those tomorrow. But you know what we have lost? We've lost part of our soul in this process. I'm going to get a little Christian-y on you here for a second. Part of doing works, part of serving man, part of helping out people, part of the benefit of that is supposed to be, in doing so, you as a Christian become closer to God. You get to see the face of God by doing God's work. Your soul gets a little bit closer to God in doing God's work. There is a spiritual benefit for you to help out people. The people also get help. That's a great fringe benefit. But the idea behind it is for your spiritual benefit. Doing this brings you closer to God. If you hired a subcontractor, in this case the U.S. government, to do that for you, what spiritual benefit are you getting? The answer is none. Now, that person is still over here getting helped, but you're getting nothing out of it as a giver. A good friend of mine is the director of student development at Averett University. They've had a long pipeline of students from Finland over the last 50 years, I guess. They had a big capital campaign at Averett where they're trying to raise money from alumni to, build this, that, whatever. And they decided, well, we got so many alumni in Finland, a couple thousand at least, including a former Finnish president. Let's travel to Finland and have a money-raising face-to-face with these guys. It was a spectacular failure. Wanna know why? The people of Finland, nice, good folk, they have no concept of philanthropy. You may as well be driving in from Jupiter. Again, these are good people. But in their world, government takes care of everything. Now, more than half their income is taken to make that happen, but paying for a university, paying for a building or something, that's the government's job. And it just did not compute with them that they could take their money and time and resources and give it to an entity. That came through government. They're good people, but I think they've lost a little bit of their soul. I do think so. I think they exist to serve government, unfortunately. I mean, more than half of what they earn goes to government. I think, again, but my way of thinking, unfortunately, is dying out. We're becoming closer to Finland than we are further away. Again, they're fine folks, but they have no concept of doing individual charity. Yeah, they give to UN funds or whatever, but anyway, Buddy told me that it was like trying to explain calculus to a 7th grader. Not that they're dumb, but they just don't have the foundational concept of that. That's sad. What is the proper purpose of tax policy? Again, taxation is theft, should only be used as a last resort. We use it, of course, for quite a bit. Ideally, the first and foremost purpose of tax policy is to raise the revenue that the government needs to carry out its proper functions. Makes sense. Some believe that one of the proper functions of government is to influence people's behavior. If you want to make me angry, make that argument. Anyway, sorry, should not be inserting so much into these things. The idea behind the so-called sin taxes, cigarettes, alcohol, and whatnot, that we can dissuade people from partaking of this evil if we tax it enough. History has determined that most certainly does not work. This was a great example of what's called unintended consequences. In 1994, I believe it was, Congress, under President Clinton at the time, passed a luxury tax on yachts. Now, the idea was, we will raise these billions and billions of dollars to pay for this other good stuff, but we'll only be hitting the rich people, because who buys yachts? Joe and Jane Sixpack don't. The very, very, very rich buy the yachts. So we get them to pay it. It was a stiff, like 30-40% tax on yachts. If we can get them to pay that money on their yachts, then we can say to the people, hey, we hit the rich, and we were able to give to the poor, so to speak, Robin Hoodish. Well, here's the thing. The rich people did not, generally speaking, get to be rich by being dumb with their money, by being loose with their money. Most of the time they are rich because they were very sharp with their money. They saw that this yacht, which cost this much, now cost 40% more. They decided they didn't need to spend that money on a yacht. Okay, so that produced two problems, two very, very, very big problems. Number one, the billions of dollars that the federal government was anticipating from this tax, money that's already been allocated for another purpose that they thought was good, well, now that money's not coming in. Now, instead of getting $50 billion, they're getting $5 billion. So that's $45 billion that this purpose over here that they were going to fund with it isn't getting. So they have to tax other areas to get it. And most often, those taxes are going to affect Joe and Jane Sixpack. The second big problem from that idea was this. When the rich people stopped buying yachts, the yacht builders were devastated. The woodworkers, the carpenters, the electricians, the machinists, the welders, the specialists, the hands-on workers, the thousands of them that are used in the yacht-making industry all of a sudden had their orders plummet by 80%. No business can withstand that. Many businesses went under. Many people were laid off. So now, in addition to having this $45 million shortfall in the program you were funding, you've got a few thousand people now that are drawing unemployment because of your tax. That tax that was only supposed to soak the rich ends up hitting workers and the recipients of the program. That's called unintended consequences. That's why we think of taxation first as theft. We attach a negative connotation to it, so we avail ourselves of it very, very carefully. These questions invite us to look at our system and look at our assumptions about our system of taxation and spending. To change the direction that the government has been going before, let me put this graphic up again. This right here is a pretty good graphic demonstration of the increase in government revenues, and we're talking about less than a century here. That is an exponential increase. We had a little bit of luck here after a couple of great years of the dot-com boom in the late 80s where revenues knocked down just a little bit, but it's going back up. And yeah, in the 15 years since, it has done the exact same thing. This is an exponential increase. We're not going to turn this tide overnight, but at some point, there's got to be a breaking point. I hope your generation will adopt the idea of fiscal sanity. Unfortunately, you have got to fight that attitude we talked about. What gets people reelected to Congress is giving people stuff. If you don't give them stuff, they're not going to vote for you. And no congressperson is going to do something that will get people to not vote for you. So we have to come up with a way to establish an incentive to at least cap this off, to level it off. Because right now it's just going up, up, up. It has to level off. Rant over. Enjoy the weekend. We will meet on Monday. Have a great day.